A 62-year-old retired school teacher sat in a conference room surrounded by people who had once called her family, and the only thing they left her was a single-dollar bill. The Halford family watched her fold it quietly and walk out into the snow, and not one of them stopped laughing long enough to wonder why the old man's lawyer was already watching her leave with something close to relief in his eyes. But what none of them knew, what even Maren Calloway herself wouldn't discover until the following morning, was that the crumpled bill in her coat pocket was never meant as an insult. It was the only safe way a dying man could hand someone the key to $50 million without his own grandson tearing it apart before she ever had the chance to use it. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories about quiet people who refuse to stay small, consider subscribing to this channel. A simple tap is all it takes. And this story, I promise you, is one you will carry with you long after it ends. The law offices of Byrne, Callister and Pratt occupied the third floor of the oldest brick building in downtown Geneva, New York. The elevator had been broken since October, so Maren Calloway climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the iron railing, the other holding the strap of a leather purse that had seen better decades. Her knees ached. They always did in winter. 35 years of standing in front of classrooms had done something permanent to her joints, a quiet tax the profession never warned you about. She reached the third-floor landing slightly out of breath and paused before the frosted glass door. Through it she could already hear voices, low murmurs, the occasional sharp laugh, the sound of people who had arrived early because they were eager, not because they were nervous. Maren smoothed the front of her coat. It was a good coat, dark wool, well-kept, the kind of garment a careful woman could make last 15 years if she brushed it properly and stored it with cedar. Wallace had once told her she looked like the most dignified teacher in the Finger Lakes whenever she wore it. She had laughed and told him dignity didn't pay the heating bill. Now Wallace was gone, and the coat was all she had left of that conversation. She pushed the door open. The conference room was long and narrow, with tall windows that looked out over the gray surface of Seneca Lake in the distance. Snow had been falling since dawn, and the sky hung low and heavy over the hills, pressing down on the bare vineyards that lined the slopes above town. The room smelled of fresh coffee and old wood, and something faintly chemical, the way law offices always did, as if the paper itself had a scent. Sterling Halford sat at the far end of the table. He was 45, lean, sharp-jawed, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who had never questioned whether they deserved them. His watch caught the overhead light every time he moved his wrist. He did not look up when Maren entered. Beside him sat Vivienne Halford, Wallace's daughter. 50 years old, blonde hair pulled back neatly, a silk scarf draped over one shoulder. She held a ceramic travel mug between both hands and stared at the table with the distant expression of someone who had already decided this was a formality. Two other relatives Maren barely recognized occupied chairs along the wall. A cousin from Albany, an uncle's widow from Rochester, people who appeared at funerals and readings and nowhere in between. Maren took the only empty chair near the door. She set her purse on the floor beside her feet and folded her hands in her lap. No one greeted her. She had expected that. For 18 months after the divorce, Maren had continued visiting Wallace Halford at his lakeside home 3 times a week. She brought him meals she cooked herself. She drove him to oncology appointments in Syracuse when the cancer spread to his liver. She sat beside him on the wide stone porch overlooking the water, while the autumn light turned the hills copper and rust. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply watched the lake. Russell, her ex-husband, Wallace's only son, had stopped visiting his father entirely after the separation. Sterling, Russell's boy from his first marriage, came once a month to discuss company numbers. Vivian called on Sundays, 15 minutes exactly, never longer. But Maren came 3 times a week for 4 years. She came because Wallace had never treated her like an outsider, even after the divorce. She came because the old man told stories about building Halford lumber from a single sawmill in 1968. And his voice changed when he told them, growing younger, almost musical. She came because on the last warm afternoon of September, Wallace had reached across the armrest of his porch chair and rested his hand briefly on hers, and his grip had trembled, and he had said something she would never forget. His voice had come rough and low the way it always did near the end of a long day. Maren, you are the only person in this family who still knows how to sit with someone without wanting something from them. She had not answered. She had simply turned her hand over beneath his and held it. That was 4 months before he died. Now she sat in a conference room full of people who had wanted plenty from Wallace Halford, and every one of them had gotten it except her. Clement Byrne entered from a side office carrying a thick leather binder. He was a tall man in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the careful posture of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. He wore reading glasses on a thin chain around his neck. He nodded once to the room, sat down, and opened the binder without ceremony. His voice was measured, unhurried. This is the last will and testament of Wallace Edward Halford, executed on the 14th of March and witnessed in accordance with New York state law. The room settled into silence. Even Sterling stopped adjusting his cufflinks. Byrne read. The language was precise, layered with legal phrasing that turned simple things, a house, a portfolio, a company, into architecture. To Vivian Halford, the lakeside residence in Halcyon, along with associated land parcels and a managed investment account, valued at approximately $11 million. Vivian closed her eyes briefly, the way someone does when confirming something they already knew. To Sterling Halford, controlling interest in Halford Lumber, LLC, including all operational authority subsidiary holdings and associated intellectual property. Sterling leaned back in his chair. A small, satisfied movement. The chair didn't creak. Nothing about Sterling ever creaked. The reading continued. Trust disbursements, charitable allocations, a vintage car collection left to the cousin from Albany, who looked genuinely surprised. A set of first edition novels left to the uncle's widow, who looked less so. Minutes passed. Maren listened without moving. Her thumb traced a slow circle on the back of her left hand, an old habit she had developed during parent-teacher conferences, when she needed to stay calm while someone's mother accused her of grading unfairly. Finally, Byrne turned to the last page. He paused. It was a small pause, barely noticeable, but Maren saw it. The way his eyes lifted from the page for just a fraction of a second before he continued. His voice remained steady. And finally, to Maren Calloway. Sterling's head turned. Vivian's mug stopped halfway to her lips. Byrne read carefully. In recognition of her years of companionship and care during my final illness, and to preserve the legal integrity of this document, I leave to Maren Calloway the sum of $1 United States dollar. Silence. Then Sterling laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It was worse than that. It was quiet, controlled, the kind of laugh that came from a man who believed the world had just confirmed everything he already thought about the people beneath him. The cousin from Albany smiled uncomfortably. The uncle's widow looked away. Vivian set her mug down slowly. She looked at Maren, and her expression was not cruelty. It was something Maren had seen many times in her teaching career. The look a parent gives a child who has tried very hard at something and still failed. Pity dressed up as sympathy. Byrne reached into his vest pocket and produced a $1 bill. He slid it across the polished table. It traveled the full length of the wood and stopped directly in front of Maren's folded hands. George Washington's face stared up at the ceiling. $1. For 4 years of early mornings and late evenings. For oncology waiting rooms and pharmacy runs. For quiet afternoons on the porch when Wallace's hands shook too badly to hold his own coffee cup, and Maren held it for him without being asked. $1. Sterling leaned forward. His voice carried the casual ease of someone who had never once questioned his place in a room. Well, Maren, I suppose Dad always said you were a woman of simple needs. Maren did not respond. She looked at the bill. The green ink, the faint texture of the paper, the serial number printed along the edge in tiny letters that meant nothing to anyone except the machines that counted them. She reached forward and picked it up. The paper felt almost weightless. She folded it once carefully, the way she used to fold notes from students before tucking them into her desk drawer. Then she slid it into the inside pocket of her wool coat, the pocket closest to her chest. She stood. For a moment she looked around the room. Not at Sterling, not at Vivian. At the windows behind them where the snow was falling harder now, and the distant surface of Seneca Lake had disappeared entirely behind a curtain of white. Her voice came quiet almost to herself. He always said the lake hides its best things at the bottom. No one in the room understood what she meant. She picked up her purse, turned, and walked out the door. Her footsteps faded down the stairwell. The frosted glass settled back into stillness. Sterling chuckled once more and turned to Vivian. Sentimental to the end. But at the far side of the table, Clement Byrne closed the leather binder slowly and said nothing. His face revealed nothing. And if anyone had been watching closely, which no one was, they would have noticed that his hands, which had been perfectly steady throughout the entire reading, were now clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The drive back to Halcyon took 40 minutes in good weather. In the snow, it took over an hour. Maren's old sedan moved carefully along Route 14, the wipers pushing heavy flakes across the windshield in slow rhythmic sweeps. The heater worked barely. Warm air trickled from the vents, carrying the faint smell of dust and old upholstery. The Finger Lake stretched long and narrow between the hills carved by glaciers 10,000 years ago. In summer, the water turned deep blue, and the vineyards climbed the slopes in neat green rows, and tourists filled the tasting rooms along the lake roads. But in winter, the region turned inward. The vines went bare. The water darkened to iron gray. The small towns along the shores grew quiet, and the hills looked like the hunched shoulders of old men waiting for something to pass. Maren knew this landscape the way she knew the inside of her own hands. She had taught 4th grade at Halcyon Elementary for 31 years. She had watched 3 generations of children learn to read in her classroom. She had memorized the way the light fell differently through the schoolroom windows in September and in March. How the lake looked from the playground on the first warm day of spring. How the air smelled when the vineyards were being pruned, in late autumn, sharp and green, and full of something ending. Now she drove through the snow with a dollar bill in her coat pocket, and nothing waiting for her at home except a rented cabin at the edge of town that belonged to someone else. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road behind a row of bare birch trees. It was small, 2 rooms plus a bathroom, with a wood-burning stove that heated the front room and left the bedroom cold. The rent was $600 a month, which she managed through her teacher's pension and nothing else. The divorce had taken the house on Orchard Lane, the house she and Russell had lived in for 28 years. The house where she had planted the garden, built the bookshelves, raised Genevieve from infant to woman. The court had awarded it to Russell because his name was on the deed, and his family's lawyers were better than the one Maren could afford. She had walked out of that courtroom with 2 suitcases and a box of books. That was 14 months ago. Inside the cabin, Maren hung her coat on the hook beside the door and stood still for a moment. The stove had gone cold while she was away. She crouched down, opened the iron door, and began rebuilding the fire the way Wallace had taught her years ago, crumpled newspaper first, then kindling, then a single split log laid at an angle so the air could move beneath it. Wallace had been particular about fires. He believed the way a person built a fire said something about their patience. The flames caught. The stove began ticking softly as the metal expanded with heat. Maren sat in the wooden chair beside the stove and took the dollar bill from her coat pocket. She unfolded it slowly. The paper was slightly warm from being pressed against her body during the drive. She held it between her thumb and forefinger and turned it over once. Then again. $1. The fire popped. Shadows moved across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, and she could hear the birch branches scraping faintly against the roof like fingers tapping for permission to come in. She thought about Wallace's porch, the stone railing, the way the lake looked at dusk when the water was so still it doubled the sky. She thought about the old man's hands, thick-knuckled and liver-spotted, resting on the arm of his chair, while he told stories about the early days of Halford lumber, how he had started with one sawmill and a truck he had to push-start every morning, how he had built the company into something that employed 3,000 people across 4 counties. She thought about the last thing Wallace ever said to her 3 days before he died. His voice had been barely audible by then, a dry whisper that she had to lean close to hear. She had pressed her ear near his lips, and his breath had been warm and thin against her skin. He had whispered, "You'll understand soon. Just don't let them rush you." She had not understood. She had assumed it was the morphine talking the way it sometimes turned his words into riddles that meant nothing. She had squeezed his hand and told him to rest. Now, sitting in a cold cabin with a $1 bill in her fingers, she wondered if the old man had been more lucid than she thought. Maren set the bill on the small table beside the stove. She pulled a blanket over her lap and watched the fire until exhaustion pulled her under. She slept in the chair. The stove burned low. The snow kept falling. And somewhere around 5:30 in the morning, before the sun had climbed above the eastern ridge of the lake, a pair of headlights appeared through the birch trees. Maren woke to the sound of tires on frozen gravel. Not the mail carrier too early. Not a neighbor she didn't have any close enough to arrive unannounced. She stood slowly, her back stiff from sleeping upright, and moved to the window. A dark sedan was parked beside her car. The engine was still running, exhaust rising in white plumes against the gray dawn. A tall figure stepped out and walked toward her door, with the measured pace of someone who had planned this visit carefully. The knock came, 3 times, unhurried. Maren opened the door halfway. Clement Byrne stood on her porch snow, dusting the shoulders of his overcoat, his breath clouded in the cold air. He held a leather portfolio under one arm. His expression was calm, serious, and entirely different from the neutral mask he had worn in the conference room the day before. His voice was measured but clear. "Mrs. Calloway, I apologize for the hour." Maren studied him. The cold pressed against her face through the open door. "You read me a $1 inheritance yesterday. Now you're at my door before sunrise." Byrne nodded once. Yes, because the reading yesterday was not the full story. Maren did not move. Wind slipped through the gap between the door and the frame, carrying snowflakes across the threshold. Byrne spoke carefully. The dollar was not a final gesture. It was a legal mechanism. Under New York estate law, a nominal bequest prevents the named party from contesting the will. It establishes that the testator did not forget or overlook them. Maren frowned slightly. "So Wallace left me $1 to keep me from asking for more." Byrne's eyes held hers steadily. "No, he left you $1 so that no one, especially Sterling, would have reason to examine the rest of what he prepared for you. The $1 was the lock on the door. I am here to give you the key." The birch tree swayed above the cabin. The morning sky was the color of unpolished silver. Maren stood in the doorway for several long seconds, the cold air moving around her like water. Then she stepped aside. Byrne entered the cabin. He glanced at the stove, which had gone cold again. Without a word, Maren crouched down and began rebuilding the fire. Byrne waited. He understood patience. He had worked for Wallace Halford for 19 years, and the old man had taught him that certain conversations should not begin until the room was warm. When the flames caught and the stove began ticking again, Maren sat down and looked at him. Byrne opened the leather portfolio on the small table. Inside was a folded map, several documents bound with a metal clip and a brass key. The map was not new. Its creases had softened with age, and pencil markings traced lines across the topography of the Western Finger Lakes ridges, Lakeshore's back roads that didn't appear on any commercial atlas. Byrne spread the map across the table beside the dollar bill, which still lay where Maren had left it the night before. His finger tapped a small red circle drawn along the southern shore of Seneca Lake, 15 miles from Halcyon. His voice remained low. 70 acres, purchased 8 years ago through a private holding entity that cannot be traced to the Halford family through public records. The deed is in your name. It has been in your name since the day Wallace signed the trust. Maren stared at the map. Her hand moved instinctively toward the dollar bill beside it, as if the two objects now belonged together. She looked up. Why hide land from his own family? Byrne folded his hands. Because his own family is the reason it needed hiding. The fire crackled softly. The cabin had begun to warm, but Maren felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with temperature. Byrne continued. Wallace spent the last 6 years of his life watching his grandson dismantle everything he built. Sterling Halford has been systematically draining Halford lumber through a network of shell companies, fraudulent contracts, and offshore accounts. The total amount diverted exceeds $47 million. Maren's breath caught. She pressed her fingertips against the edge of the table. Byrne's voice did not waver. If Wallace had confronted Sterling publicly, the company would have collapsed overnight. Investigations, lawsuits, criminal charges, all of it would have destroyed the business and put 3,000 workers out of their jobs. Loggers Mill. Operators, truck drivers, mechanics, people with families across 4 counties who depend on Halford lumber for their living. Maren understood that kind of math. She had spent her career in a town where the mill and the lumberyard were the 2 largest employers. She had taught the children of those workers. She knew their names. Byrne reached into the portfolio and removed the brass key. He set it beside the map. So Wallace made a different plan. The key was old but well kept. The brass had been polished recently. Maren picked it up and turned it slowly between her fingers. It was heavier than she expected. Byrne stood. I need to take you there, today. Maren looked at him. Take me where? Byrne glanced toward the window where the snow had thinned to a fine drifting veil against the morning sky. To the property. To what Wallace built beneath it. The drive took nearly an hour. Byrne's sedan followed narrow roads that wound between frozen vineyards and bare orchards, climbing gradually into the hills above the southern shore of Seneca Lake. The landscape grew quieter as they moved farther from Halcyon. Farmhouses appeared less frequently. Fences sagged beneath the weight of snow. The forest birch and hemlock and old-growth oak pressed closer to the road, until the sky became a narrow ribbon of gray above the treetops. Maren watched the passing trees in silence. She had lived in the Finger Lakes her entire life, but she had never traveled this particular road. It felt like entering a part of the region that had been quietly waiting undisturbed while the rest of the world moved forward without it. Byrne drove without speaking. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the soft whisper of snow against the windshield. Eventually, the road turned to gravel, then to packed dirt. The sedan slowed as it climbed a final ridge, and then the trees opened into a wide clearing and Maren saw it. A farmstead sat in the center of the clearing, framed on 3 sides by forest, and on the 4th by a long sloping meadow that ran down toward the distant gleam of the lake. The main house was old but solid white, clapboard dark shutters. A stone chimney rising from one end. A large barn stood behind it. Its red paint faded to the color of dried clay. Snow covered everything. No footprints, no tire tracks. The place looked as if it had been holding its breath for years. Maren stepped out of the car. The air hit her face sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and frozen earth. She stood very still. The silence was enormous. She could hear the snow landing. Byrne came around the car and stood beside her. He did not rush her. He waited the way Wallace would have waited, with the quiet understanding that some things need to be absorbed before they can be spoken about. Maren walked toward the barn. She didn't know why. Something about the structure called to her, its patience, its endurance, the way it leaned slightly against the wind like something that had learned to bend rather than break. She had known buildings like that. She had been one herself these past 14 months. The barn doors were heavy but unlocked. She pulled one open. Inside, the air smelled of old hay and cold iron. Dust moved in the gray light that filtered through gaps in the boards. The floor was hard-packed earth, covered in places with straw that had dried to a pale gold. Byrne followed her inside. He walked to the far corner of the barn where a section of floor was covered by a heavy canvas tarp. He pulled the tarp aside. Beneath it was a steel hatch set flush into the ground, a thick handle, a keyhole. Byrne gestured toward the brass key in Maren's hand. She knelt slowly. The cold of the ground pressed through the knees of her trousers. She inserted the key. It turned with a clean mechanical sound, no rust, no resistance. Whatever was beneath this door had been maintained. She pulled the handle. The hatch lifted with a low groan of metal against concrete, revealing a square opening and a steel ladder descending into darkness. Cool air rose from below, dry and mineral-scented, the smell of stone and sealed spaces. Maren looked at Byrne. His voice was quiet. Wallace had this built in 1961 as a fallout shelter. He renovated it 5 years ago for a different purpose. Maren descended the ladder. Each rung was solid beneath her hands. 15 feet down, her shoes touched concrete. Motion-activated lights flickered on one after another, illuminating a space far larger than the barn above suggested. The bunker stretched 40 feet in both directions. Reinforced steel beams supported the ceiling. Along one wall, rows of metal shelving held sealed containers, emergency supplies, water, medical kits. But the center of the room had been transformed into something else entirely. A large desk, filing cabinets, a safe that looked like it belonged in a bank, not beneath a barn. And on the desk, alone beneath the steady light, a single envelope. Maren crossed the room slowly. Her footsteps echoed against the concrete. She reached the desk and picked up the envelope. Her name was written across the front in black ink, the handwriting firm and deliberate. She had seen that handwriting hundreds of times on notes Wallace left for her, on the kitchen counter, on birthday cards. He insisted on writing by hand on the margins of the books he lent her, with small comments penciled beside passages he wanted her to read. She broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter, and something small and smooth that slid into her palm. A stone, a flat gray lake stone worn perfectly round by decades of water. And suddenly she was not standing in a bunker. She was standing on the shore of Seneca Lake on an afternoon in late September, and the light was golden, and the water was so still it looked like glass. Wallace stood beside her, leaning on his cane, his white hair lifting slightly in the breeze. He bent down slowly. The motion cost him visible effort, and picked up a stone from the waterline. He turned it in his fingers, feeling its weight, its smoothness. Then he placed it gently into her open hand. His voice had been warm and rough, like a road that had carried a great deal of traffic and was better for it. Keep that. The lake holds its best things at the bottom. People only ever see the surface. She had slipped the stone into her pocket and smiled, and said nothing, because some moments were better left without words. Now the same stone rested in her palm in an underground room, and the man who had given it to her was gone, and his handwriting on the letter was the closest thing left to his voice. She unfolded the letter. Maren, if you are reading this, then the dollar did exactly what it was supposed to do. You were never meant to receive it as a final word. It was the only legal way I could deliver you the truth without my family tearing it apart before you ever had the chance to hold it. You cared for me when no one else would. Not because I paid you, not because you expected anything. You came because the porch was quiet and the lake was beautiful, and you understood that sometimes a man just needs someone to sit beside him while the light changes. You are the only person I trust to finish what I could not. Maren's vision blurred. She blinked, and a single tear struck the page, darkening a small circle beside the word trust. She kept reading. The letter told her everything. Sterling's fraud laid out in careful detail. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the falsified contracts that had drained Halford Lumber of $47 million over 6 years. Wallace had hired investigators. He had gathered proof. But confronting Sterling publicly would have destroyed the company and devastated the communities that depended on it. So he had built a different path. $50 million transferred quietly into a protected trust over 5 years, hidden outside the company, outside Sterling's reach. The trust could only be activated by the person named in this letter, Maren Calloway. But there was a condition. To claim the inheritance, she had to expose Sterling's crimes and remove him from control of Halford Lumber. If she failed, the money would be surrendered to federal investigators, and the company would collapse under criminal prosecution. 3,000 jobs gone. Maren lowered the letter slowly. The bunker hummed with the faint sound of the ventilation system. The stone sat warm in her left hand. The dollar bill pressed against her chest from inside her coat pocket close to her heart, where she had placed it without thinking the day before. She stood very still for a long time. Byrne descended the ladder behind her. He reached the bottom and waited. Maren's voice came quiet, steady. The voice of a woman who had spent 35 years holding the attention of rooms full of children who didn't want to listen. He's asking me to take down his own grandson. Byrne nodded once. He's asking the only person he trusted. Maren looked at the safe, at the filing cabinets, at the stacks of evidence Wallace Halford had spent years assembling in secret beneath a barn that no one knew existed on land, that no one knew he owned, for a woman that everyone in his family had just dismissed with a single dollar bill. She closed her fingers around the lake stone. Outside, the snow had stopped. Through the hills above Seneca Lake, a thin line of pale light broke through the clouds for the first time in days. It moved slowly across the frozen meadow, touching the roof of the barn, the chimney of the house, the tops of the birch trees that swayed gently at the edge of the clearing. And far below, in the quiet of the bunker, Maren Calloway opened the first filing cabinet and began to read. She did not know yet that within 72 hours the grandson who had laughed at her inheritance would discover what she was doing. She did not know that the daughter she loved most in the world would stand between her and the truth. And she did not know that the small stone in her hand, a gift from a dying man on a lake shore, would become the only thing she held on to the night everything nearly fell apart. But she knew one thing. Wallace Halford had not left her a dollar because she was worthless. He had left her a dollar because she was the only one worth trusting. And that was enough to begin. The filing cabinets held more than Maren expected. Not more in volume, she had braced herself for that, but more in precision. Wallace Halford had not simply gathered evidence. He had organized it the way a man organizes the tools in his workshop, each piece placed where it could be reached without fumbling, each document connected to the next by a logic that became visible only after you had spent hours following it. Maren spent the rest of that first day in the bunker reading. She read slowly. She had always read slowly. It was one of the qualities that made her a careful teacher and a frustrating dinner companion, and she had long ago stopped apologizing for it. Wallace had understood. He had once told her that fast readers skip the words between the words, and those were the ones that mattered most. The financial documents were different from anything she had encountered in 35 years of lesson plans and report cards. They were dense with abbreviations she didn't recognize, account numbers that stretched across the page like the coordinates of a map drawn in a language she hadn't learned. Shell corporations with names that sounded invented: Ridgeline Partners, LLC, Northfall Capital Group, Seneca Basin Holdings. Wire transfer records showing amounts that moved in patterns she couldn't yet decipher. She understood none of it. Not yet. But she understood structure. She understood how information organized itself when you gave it time and attention. She had spent decades teaching 9-year-olds how to break a paragraph into its parts, how to find the main idea buried beneath the details, how to notice when a sentence was trying to hide something important inside something ordinary. Fraud, she suspected, worked the same way. She took a red pen from the desk drawer, the same kind she had used for grading, and began marking, circling names that appeared more than once, underlining dates that clustered together, drawing arrows between transactions that seemed to mirror each other across different accounts. By the time she climbed the ladder back into the barn, the light had changed. Late afternoon. The clearing was quiet. The snow on the meadow untouched, the lake visible now through a gap in the trees, a long dark line against the white hills. She drove back to Halcyon in silence, the lake stone in her coat pocket pressing gently against her thigh. The next 3 days blurred together. Maren returned to the property each morning before dawn, driving the narrow roads while the hills were still black silhouettes against a sky that brightened slowly from charcoal to pearl. She descended into the bunker with a thermos of tea and a notebook and sat at the desk for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours. She filled page after page with notes written in the small, careful handwriting her students had always been able to read from the back of the room. She made progress, slowly, painfully, like a woman trying to read a novel in a language she was learning one word at a time. And she made mistakes. On the second day, she spent 4 hours tracing a series of wire transfers that she believed connected Sterling to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. She built a careful chain of documents. She wrote notes in the margins. She felt for the first time the sharp satisfaction of finding a pattern hidden inside noise. Then she realized she had misread a date. January, not June. The entire chain collapsed. 4 hours of work reduced to a stack of pages connected by nothing. She sat very still at the desk. The bunker hummed. The ventilation system pushed air through the underground space with a sound like slow mechanical breathing. Maren looked at the red pen in her hand. She thought about the hundreds of times she had written "try again" in the margins of a student's paper, and how simple those words had seemed when she was the one writing them. She picked up the next folder and began again. On the fourth morning, Byrne was waiting at the barn when she arrived. He was not alone. Two people stood beside him in the cold. The first was a woman in her mid-30s. Dark hair cut short, wearing a canvas jacket that looked like it had survived several winters worse than this one. She held a battered leather briefcase in one hand and a paper cup of gas station coffee in the other. Her posture was alert, efficient, the stance of someone accustomed to walking into rooms where she was not expected and leaving with information no one wanted to give. The second was younger, mid-20s, thin build, wire-rimmed glasses that fogged when he exhaled. He carried a backpack that appeared to contain more technology than the entire Halcyon Public Library. He looked cold. He also looked like he hadn't slept in some time, though. With his particular kind of face, it was difficult to tell whether that was a temporary condition or a permanent feature. Byrne gestured toward the woman first. Sylvie Marchetti, forensic financial investigator. She has worked cases involving corporate fraud for the past 11 years. Sylvie extended her hand. Her grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who did not confuse politeness with warmth. Mr. Halford hired me 2 years ago to build the preliminary case. I've been waiting to meet the person he trusted to finish it. Maren studied her face. There was nothing soft in it, but nothing hostile either. The face of a woman who had learned to read numbers the way Maren read children, patiently, thoroughly, and with the understanding that the truth usually hid behind the thing that looked most ordinary. Byrne nodded toward the younger man. Rowan Graves, Digital Forensics. Rowan pushed his glasses up his nose and offered an awkward wave rather than a handshake. I find things people delete, bank records, emails, server logs. If Sterling erased it, I can probably get it back. Maren looked at both of them, then at Byrne, then back at the barn door that concealed the ladder to the bunker, where she had spent 4 days drowning in documents she barely understood. Something shifted in her chest. Not relief exactly. Something closer to the feeling she had on the first day of every school year, when the classroom was finally arranged, and the supplies were stacked, and the desks were clean, and she stood at the door waiting for the children to arrive. The feeling of knowing she could not do this alone, and being grateful that she would not have to. Her voice came careful the way it always did when she was testing whether someone could be trusted. I've been making notes, 3 notebooks full. Most of them are probably wrong. Sylvie took a sip of her coffee. Wrong notes are the second most useful kind. They show you where the right ones aren't. Maren almost smiled. It was the kind of thing she would have said to a struggling student. They descended together, and the bunker that had felt too large for one woman began to feel like exactly the right size for 3. Sylvie worked methodically through the filing cabinets Maren had already begun marking. Within hours, she confirmed what Maren had suspected, but could not prove the wire transfers were layered deliberately, each one passing through at least 3 intermediary accounts before reaching its destination. Sterling had not simply stolen money. He had built an architecture of theft, careful, repetitive, designed to look like ordinary business transactions to anyone who wasn't looking closely enough. Rowan set up his equipment in the far corner of the bunker. 2 laptops and external hard drive cables that connected to servers Maren couldn't name. His fingers moved across the keyboards with a speed that made Maren think of the student she'd once had, who could solve math problems faster than she could write them on the board. Maren's role became clear without anyone naming it. She was not the investigator. She was not the analyst. She was the person who asked the questions that reorganized everything. Sylvie would lay out a chain of transactions. Rowan would pull corresponding digital records, and Maren would look at both and say something like, "But if this company was created in March, and Sterling signed this contract in January, who authorized the transfer in February?" The room would go quiet. Sylvie would frown. Rowan would start typing, and 10 minutes later, a new connection would appear. It was teaching. A different kind of teaching, but teaching nonetheless. The same instinct she had always relied on, the ability to see where a story had a gap and to ask the question that filled it. By the end of the first week, they had confirmed the outline of Sterling's operation. 14 shell companies, transfers totaling over $30 million across 6 years. Contracts for timber deliveries that were invoiced, paid, and never fulfilled. The money disappeared into accounts held under names that meant nothing in states where corporate transparency meant even less. Sylvie spread a timeline across the desk one evening, a long strip of paper covered in dates and arrows and dollar amounts. She tapped the earliest entry. This $3 million moved through a holding company registered in Delaware. It's the first confirmed illegal transfer we can trace directly to Sterling's personal authorization. Maren leaned forward. The red circle Sylvie had drawn around the transaction looked exactly like the marks Maren made when a student's essay finally found its thesis. Rowan looked up from his screen. "I pulled the digital signature from the authorization. It's Sterling's encrypted credentials, no question." Maren pressed her fingertips against the edge of the desk. $3 million, confirmed, for the first time since she had opened Wallace's letter. The weight of what she was doing shifted from abstract to concrete. This was not a story. This was a crime with a name attached to it. She sat back, the lake stone pressed against her leg through the fabric of her pocket. She touched it briefly through the cloth. The moment lasted only a few seconds. Then Sylvie turned the page to the next transaction, and the work continued. That evening, driving back toward Halcyon, Maren noticed something she had not expected. A paper bag sat on the hood of her car. She stopped. The clearing was empty. No tire tracks other than her own. She opened the bag carefully. Inside was a jar of apple butter, homemade, still faintly warm. No note, no name. Just a quart jar with a cloth lid tied with kitchen string, the kind of jar that women in this part of New York had been filling and giving away for 100 years. Maren looked toward the trees at the edge of the clearing. Nothing moved. The snow lay undisturbed, except for a single set of boot prints that came from the direction of the nearest farm road and disappeared back the same way. Someone knew she was here. Someone had walked through the snow to leave her something and had chosen not to be seen doing it. She drove home with the jar on the passenger seat. And for the first time in weeks, the cabin did not feel quite so empty when she walked through the door. 2 days later, another small gift appeared, a cord of firewood neatly stacked beside the barn. No note. The following morning, a wool blanket folded on the porch railing of the farmhouse, smelling of cedar and lavender. The kind of scent that attached itself to the closets of women who had lived in the same house for 50 years. Maren never discovered who left them. She suspected it was the families who lived along the farm roads that bordered the property, people whose fathers and grandfathers had worked at Halford Lumber. People who perhaps had heard something, a rumor, a whisper, the kind of quiet knowledge that moves through small towns the way water moves through limestone slowly and without ever being seen. She accepted each gift without seeking the giver. That too was something she had learned from Wallace. Some kindnesses lose their meaning the moment you try to repay them. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening. Maren was alone in her cabin, rereading her own notes the way she used to reread student papers, searching for what she had missed the first time. The fire in the stove burned low. The lake stone sat on the table beside a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. The phone buzzed. The name on the screen made her breath catch. Genevieve, her daughter, 34 years old. Brown hair that curled the same way Maren's had before the grey came in. Hands that were smaller copies of her mother's hands. The girl who had once sat in Maren's lap on the porch of the house on Orchard Lane and asked her mother to read the same picture book 7 times in a row, and Maren had read it all 7 times without once suggesting they try a different one. Maren answered. Her voice came careful the way it always did when she spoke to Genevieve now, as if the words themselves had to be handled gently, or they would break something between them. Genevieve. A pause. When her daughter spoke, the voice was clipped, strained, stripped of the warmth that used to fill their calls before the divorce turned the family into opposing territories. Genevieve's voice came tight, almost rehearsed. Mom, I need you to listen to me. Sterling knows you've been spending time at that property near the lake. I don't know what you're doing there, and I don't want to know. But you need to stop. Maren closed her eyes. The fire popped. A log shifted inside the stove. Genevieve, how does Sterling know where I've been? The silence on the line stretched long enough that Maren could hear her daughter breathing. Quick, shallow breaths. The breathing of someone who was afraid but had decided to be angry instead, because anger was easier to hold. Genevieve's voice dropped lower. That doesn't matter. What matters is that he's paying attention now. He promoted me last month, Mom. I'm running the Northwest Division. If you do something that destabilizes the company, it doesn't just affect Sterling. It affects me. It affects everyone who works there. Maren opened her eyes. She stared at the lake stone on the table. Your grandfather built that company. And Sterling is running it now. That's how inheritance works. The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Inheritance. $1. A room full of laughter. Maren felt the memory move through her body like a current. She spoke quietly. Is that what he told you to say? Genevieve's voice hardened. Nobody told me to say anything. I'm trying to protect my career and my family and my mother, who apparently has decided to spend her retirement hiding in a barn. Maren did not answer for several seconds. She picked up the lake stone and turned it slowly in her fingers. Smooth, heavy for its size. The kind of weight that accumulates slowly grain by grain over years of water pressing against rock. The next words left her mouth softer than she intended. I remember when you were 7. You told me you wanted to be a teacher like me. You stood on a chair in the kitchen and read a story to your stuffed animals and gave them all grades. Mom, don't. You gave the bear an A. You gave the rabbit a B+ because he didn't sit still. Mom, please. The line went quiet again. Maren could hear something in her daughter's breathing that Genevieve was trying very hard to hide. The sound of a woman caught between loyalty and fear, unable to name either one. Maren spoke one last time. I love you, Genevieve. That has never been conditional. The call ended. Whether Genevieve hung up or the connection simply died, Maren could not tell. The screen went dark. The cabin returned to silence. Maren set the phone face down on the table. She placed the lake stone beside it. She sat very still while the fire burned low and the night pressed against the windows, and for the first time since she had descended into the bunker, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she was doing. She was not just fighting a corporation. She was standing on the opposite side of a line from her own daughter. And she had no idea which side Genevieve would choose when the moment came. The next 10 days moved with the slow, relentless rhythm of winter in the Finger Lakes. Snow fell, melted slightly, froze, and fell again. The hills above Seneca Lake turned white, then gray, then white once more. Inside the bunker, the work continued. Sylvie traced the money. Rowan chased the digital ghosts. Maren asked her questions, read her documents, filled her notebooks with the careful handwriting of a woman who had never learned to write carelessly. And slowly, the way ice forms on the surface of a lake, invisibly at first, then suddenly solid, the case against Sterling. Halford took shape. 37 confirmed fraudulent transactions, 14 shell companies, 4 offshore accounts in 3 different countries, contracts for timber deliveries that existed only on paper, invoices paid for services never rendered, an empire of absence, things that should have been there and weren't money that should have stayed and didn't. Maren understood now why Wallace had chosen her. Not because she was clever, not because she was brave, because she was patient. And patience in a fight against a man who had spent years building his lies quickly was the only weapon that could not be outrun. But Sterling was not patient, and he was not blind. The afternoon he appeared at the property, Maren was alone. Sylvie had driven to Syracuse to meet with a contact who had information about one of the offshore accounts. Rowan was in Halcyon running server queries from the back booth of a diner that had the only reliable internet connection within 20 miles. Byrne was in Geneva preparing legal filings. Maren was in the farmhouse heating water on the old gas stove for tea when she heard tires on the gravel road. She moved to the window. A black SUV, new polished, absurdly clean for a back road in February, pulled into the clearing and stopped beside the barn. The driver's door opened, and Sterling Halford stepped out. He wore a dark overcoat and gloves. He looked around the property slowly, the way a man surveys something he already considers his own. Then he walked toward the farmhouse. Maren's hand tightened on the edge of the counter. Her first instinct was fear. It moved through her body, fast and cold, the way it had on the day she sat in the courtroom and watched a judge sign away her house. The fear of someone who has been made small by powerful people and knows exactly how it feels. Her second instinct was older and deeper. She released the counter. She straightened her back. She wiped her hands on the cloth that hung beside the stove. And she walked to the front door and opened it before Sterling had the chance to knock. He stopped on the porch step. For a moment, something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps at being met rather than discovered. His voice carried the same casual authority she remembered from the conference room. Maren, interesting place to spend your winter. Maren stood in the doorway. She did not step aside. I'm making tea. Was there something you needed? Sterling glanced past her toward the interior of the house. His eyes moved quickly, scanning, assessing the way they moved across balance sheets. Then he looked toward the barn. Funny thing about this property, he said. I had our records searched. No connection to the Halford estate. No connection to Dad's holdings. Just a piece of land in the middle of nowhere, deeded to a retired school teacher. Maren met his eyes. People buy property, Sterling. It's not unusual. On a teacher's pension. I'm resourceful. Sterling smiled. It was not the smile of a man who found something amusing. It was the smile of a man who wanted you to know he was choosing for now to be pleasant. His voice dropped slightly. Whatever you're doing out here, Maren, I'd encourage you to think carefully about whether it's worth the trouble. Maren did not blink. I'm drinking tea and watching the snows. The trouble seems manageable. Sterling held her gaze for 3 long seconds. Then he turned and looked once more at the barn. The door was closed. The canvas tarp covering the hatch was invisible from outside. There was nothing to see. He walked back to the SUV without another word. The engine started. The vehicle turned on the narrow road and disappeared down the hill. Maren stood on the porch until the sound of the engine faded entirely. Then she went inside, sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both palms flat against the wood until her hands stopped shaking. Someone had told Sterling about this property. Someone who knew where she had been spending her days. The list of people who knew was very short. Byrne, Sylvie, Rowan, and Genevieve. Maren picked up the lake stone from where she had left it on the kitchen windowsill that morning. She held it in her closed fist and stared at the wall and said nothing for a very long time. 3 nights later, the crisis arrived. Rowan had been working on recovering data from a damaged hard drive, one of several stored in the bunker safe. This particular drive, Sylvie had determined, contained the authorization records for Sterling's largest single transfer, $11 million moved through a shell company in Wyoming to an account in the Channel Islands. Without this data, the core of the case had a hole. With it, the case was airtight. The drive had been failing for weeks. Corrupted sectors, read errors. Rowan had tried every recovery method he knew, working through nights in the bunker, while the ventilation system hummed and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. On the 3rd night, the drive failed completely. The screen displayed a single line of text that Rowan stared at for a full minute before he spoke. His voice was flat, exhausted. "It's gone. The controller burned out. I can't read it." Sylvie stood behind him, arms crossed. She said nothing. Her silence was worse than any reaction. Maren sat at the desk across the room. The red pen lay motionless beside an open notebook. She looked at Rowan, then at Sylvie, then at the dark screen. The bunker felt smaller than it had in weeks. The concrete walls pressed inward. The hum of the ventilation sounded like the breathing of something large and indifferent. Maren stood slowly. She walked to the far wall of the bunker where the original emergency supplies from the 1960s were still stored on the metal shelving. She stood with her back to the room. Her hand moved to her coat pocket. The lake stone. She wrapped her fingers around it and felt its weight, its smoothness, the way it fit perfectly into the curve of her palm, as if it had been shaped for exactly this hand. She thought about the clearing, the snow, the jar of apple butter left by someone she would never meet, the cord of firewood stacked without a note, the blanket that smelled of cedar. She thought about 3,000 workers spread across 4 counties who had never heard of a bunker under a barn, mill operators with mortgages, truck drivers with children in school, mechanics who came home with sawdust in their hair and sat down to dinner, and never once wondered whether the company they worked for was being hollowed out from the inside by the man whose name was on the building. And she thought about Wallace. Not the frail man at the end whispering riddles she didn't understand. The earlier Wallace. The one who sat on the porch in October and told her stories while the lake turned copper in the fading light. The one who said without any particular drama, just the calm observation of a man who had built something with his hands and watched it grow for 60 years. The people who work for me, they don't know my name, most of them. But I know theirs, every single one. That's the deal. That's what it means to build something that lasts. Maren opened her eyes. She turned back to the room. She spoke with the steadiness that had held the attention of 9-year-olds through fire drills and thunderstorms and the particular chaos of the last day before Christmas break. "Rowan, is there another way to get that data?" Rowan rubbed his eyes beneath his glasses. If the original transfer went through a banking server, there might be a mirror, but I'd need access to the intermediary bank's internal network. That's not something I can do remotely. Sylvie uncrossed her arms. "Which bank?" Rowan checked his notes. "First Continental Trust, Regional Bank, headquarters in Buffalo." Sylvie looked at Maren. "I have a contact there, a compliance officer I've worked with before. If I can get the right subpoena prepared, she might pull the records." Maren nodded. "How long, 48 hours if we're lucky." Maren walked back to the desk. She sat down. She picked up the red pen and opened the notebook to a clean page. She wrote a single word at the top, continue. The same word she had written at the bottom of 1,000 struggling essays, beside 1,000 misspelled sentences, above 1,000 crooked diagrams drawn by small hands that hadn't yet learned to hold the ruler straight. Continue. They worked through the night. Sylvie called her contact in Buffalo. Rowan began reconstructing the partial data from backup fragments. Maren returned to the filing cabinets and opened a drawer she had not yet reached, the last one at the bottom, heavier than the others. Inside was a different kind of document. Not financial records, personnel files, 3,000 names, employees of Halford Lumber, organized by location, by department, by years of service. Wallace had compiled them himself. Some of the entries included handwritten notes in the margins. Daughter graduated nursing school. Wife recovering from surgery. 30 years without a missed shift. Maren read them slowly. Name after name. Life after life. People Wallace had never stopped counting, even as his own body was failing. People whose jobs depended on a company that was being stolen from beneath them. She closed the drawer carefully. She placed both hands flat on the desk, and she understood completely why Wallace had chosen her for this. Not because she was strong, because she knew how to count the people who mattered. 48 hours later, Sylvie's contact delivered the mirrored transaction records. The $11 million transfer was confirmed, documented, and traceable directly to Sterling's authorization codes. The hole in the case closed like a door clicking shut. But the door that opened next was worse. Byrne called at 7 in the morning. Maren was still in the bunker. She had barely slept. The phone buzzed on the steel desk, and she answered it the way she had answered every difficult call in her life, without hesitating, because hesitation only made the news harder to hear. Byrne's voice was controlled, but beneath the control she could hear something she had never heard from him before. Urgency. Sterling's attorneys filed a motion this morning. They've petitioned to freeze the trust on grounds of suspected elder abuse, claiming Wallace was coerced into creating it during his illness. Maren's hand tightened around the phone. Byrne continued. The hearing is scheduled for Friday. If the judge grants the freeze, every asset in the trust becomes inaccessible. The evidence we've gathered becomes legally inadmissible in any related proceeding. And Sterling's investment deal at the Gala next week goes forward without obstruction. Maren calculated. Today was Tuesday. How many days? 372 hours. The bunker hummed. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Maren looked across the room at Sylvie and Rowan, who had both stopped working and were watching her. 72 hours. 3 days to expose 6 years of fraud, or watch the evidence become worthless and the company collapse under criminal investigation, taking 3,000 jobs with it. She set the phone down slowly, her fingers curled around the edge of the desk, knuckles whitening. The dollar bill still folded, still in the inside pocket of her coat, pressed against her chest. And then the second blow came. Her phone buzzed again. Not a call, a text message from Genevieve. 4 words on a bright screen in an underground room. Mom, I'm sorry, I can't. Maren stared at the message. She read it once, twice, 3 times. The words did not change. They sat on the screen like stones at the bottom of a lake, small, smooth, and impossible to move. She set the phone face down on the desk. Sylvie watched her carefully. Rowan looked away, pretending to study something on his screen. Maren reached into her pocket and took out the lake stone. She held it in her closed fist. The surface was warm from her body heat, smooth from 1,000 years of water, heavy with the weight of everything a dying man had tried to tell her. On a September afternoon, when the light was golden and the lake was still, and neither of them knew it was one of the last good days they would have. She sat in the quiet of the bunker 70 feet below a barn in the Finger Lakes, holding a stone and a silence that felt heavier than any word she had ever spoken in 35 years of standing in front of rooms full of people and asking them to try again. 72 hours. Her daughter had chosen the other side. The trust was about to disappear, and somewhere above her, Sterling Halford was already celebrating. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the desk in the bunker with the lake stone in one hand and a cold cup of tea beside the other, and she read the personnel files Wallace had compiled. All 3,000 names. She read them the way she used to read attendance rolls on the first day of school, slowly giving each name its full weight, letting the sound of it settle in her mind before moving to the next. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, Sylvie set a blanket over Maren's shoulders without saying a word. Maren didn't look up. She kept reading. By 4 she had finished. She closed the drawer. She pressed her knuckles against the cold steel surface of the desk and held them there until the chill reached bone. The gala was in 2 days. Sterling's investment deal would be signed in front of 300 guests at the Grand Halcyon Hotel on the shore of Seneca Lake. After the signing, his attorneys would finalize the trust freeze on Friday morning, and every piece of evidence in this bunker would become legally untouchable. 2 days, 1 chance. Maren stood. She looked at Sylvie and Rowan, who had both stopped pretending to work and were watching her from across the room. Her voice carried the quiet authority of a woman who had spent 35 years teaching children that every person in the room deserved to be heard. I need the evidence compiled into a single presentation. Every confirmed transaction, every shell company, every forged contract, organized chronologically with Sterling's authorization codes attached to each entry. Sylvie nodded once. Maren continued. Rowan, can you patch into the hotel's projection system remotely? Rowan blinked behind his glasses. The Grand Halcyon uses a standard AV network for events. If I can get within range of their internal Wi-Fi, yes. Maren turned to Byrne, who had been standing near the ladder listening. The federal investigators Wallace mentioned in his letter. Are they still waiting? Byrne folded his hands. They have been waiting for 2 years. 1 phone call is all it takes. Maren picked up the lake stone from the desk. She held it for a moment, turning it slowly in her fingers. Then she slid it into her coat pocket, beside the folded dollar bill that had not left her body since the day she received it. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room listened. The way her classrooms had always listened, not because she demanded it, but because the calm in her voice left no space for doubt. Make the call. The day before the gala, Maren drove to Halcyon alone. She parked outside the small hardware store on Main Street and sat in her car for several minutes watching the town move through its ordinary Wednesday. A woman carried groceries across the icy sidewalk. A man in a Halford lumber jacket held the door of the post office for someone behind him. 2 children ran past the pharmacy window, their breath rising in quick white bursts. These were the people Wallace had counted, the people whose names filled the files in the bottom drawer, the people who would lose everything if she failed, and who would never know she had tried. She drove back to the cabin and opened her closet. She owned 3 good outfits. She chose the dark wool coat, the same one she had worn to the reading, and a simple gray dress she had bought years ago for a school fundraiser. She pressed the dress with an iron that hissed and sputtered on the cabin's uneven kitchen counter. She laid the clothes over the back of the wooden chair. She set her 1 pair of good shoes beside the door. She looked at the arrangement for a long time the way a woman looks at armor before she puts it on. That night she sat beside the stove and held the dollar bill in the firelight one last time. George Washington's face, patient and expressionless, stared back at her from the creased paper. She thought about the conference room, the laughter, Sterling's voice saying simple needs, Vivian's pity. She folded the bill carefully and returned it to the inside pocket of her coat. Then she turned off the lamp and slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The lake stone on the nightstand beside her pillow, like a small, smooth sentinel keeping watch. The Grand Halcyon Hotel stood at the edge of Seneca Lake, its wide glass windows reflecting the last light of a winter afternoon. The parking lot was full of vehicles that cost more than Maren's cabin. Valets in dark coats moved between the cars like choreographed dancers. Music drifted faintly through the entrance, something orchestral, tasteful. The kind of music that existed to make wealthy people feel that their wealth was also elegant. Maren parked her sedan at the far end of the lot. She sat for a moment with the engine off, watching the guests arrive. Women in fur-trimmed coats, men adjusting cufflinks. The casual laughter of people who had never questioned whether they belonged in a room. She checked her coat pocket. The dollar bill, the lake stone. Both there. She stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance alone. The ballroom was enormous. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with clouds and gilt stars, a remnant of the hotel's 1920s grandeur. Round tables draped in white linen filled the floor. Candles flickered in glass holders. Waiters moved silently between the guests carrying trays of champagne. At the far end of the room, a raised stage held a podium and two massive projection screens that currently displayed the Halford Lumber logo in forest green and gold. Maren moved through the crowd slowly. She recognized no one and everyone, the same species of confident, well-dressed people who had filled the conference room 3 weeks ago. They glanced at her and looked away. An older woman in a simple gray dress was not worth a second look. She found a position near the back wall beside a tall arrangement of white flowers. From here, she could see the stage clearly. She could see the main entrance. And she could see Sterling Halford standing near the podium, shaking hands with investors, his smile as precise and practiced as a signature. Maren watched him. She thought about the 3,000 names in the bottom drawer. She thought about the jar of apple butter left on her car by someone she would never meet. Her hand moved to her pocket. The stone. The program began. Sterling took the stage. The ballroom quieted. His voice carried the polish of a man who had spent his life learning to make confidence sound like competence. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight marks a milestone for Halford Lumber and for the communities we serve across the Finger Lakes and beyond. Applause moved through the room like a wave. Sterling continued. He spoke about legacy, about his grandfather's vision, about growth and partnership and the future of the company Wallace had built from a single sawmill 60 years ago. He used Wallace's name 3 times. Each time Maren felt the stone grow heavier in her hand. Sterling gestured toward a table in the front row where 2 men in dark suits sat with leather folders open before them. And tonight we finalize a partnership that will carry Halford Lumber into its next chapter. He reached for a pen, and then a hand touched Maren's elbow. She turned. Genevieve stood beside her. Her daughter's face was different from the last time Maren had seen her. The sharpness was gone. The professional armor she had worn during the phone call. The clipped voice, the controlled anger had fallen away. And beneath it was something Maren recognized instantly. The expression of a child who has done something frightening and is not sure whether her mother will understand. Genevieve's eyes were red. Her hand trembled as she reached into her coat and produced a small USB drive. She held it out to Maren. Her voice was barely above a whisper, breaking at the edges. I've been copying internal files for 3 weeks. Authorization logs, email chains between Sterling and the offshore accounts. Board meeting minutes he thought were deleted. Maren stared at the drive in her daughter's hand. Genevieve's chin trembled. I know what I said on the phone. I know what it sounded like. But I needed him to believe I was on his side, or I couldn't get close enough to. Her voice failed. She pressed her lips together. A tear slid down her cheek, catching the candlelight as it fell. Maren took the USB drive. It was warm from Genevieve's hand. She closed her fingers around it. Then she reached forward and placed her other hand, the hand holding the lake stone, against her daughter's face. She cupped Genevieve's cheek the way she had when the girl was small and had fallen on the playground and come running with skinned knees, and the conviction that the pain would never end. Maren's voice came soft, the softest it had been in this entire story, I know. 2 words. A lifetime of trust compressed into a single breath. Genevieve closed her eyes. Her hand came up and pressed against her mother's. The moment lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then Maren stepped back, slid the USB into her pocket, alongside the stone and the dollar, and looked toward the stage where Sterling was reaching for the pen that would seal the deal and bury everything. She walked forward, through the crowd, past the tables, past the candles and the champagne glasses and the investors in their pressed suits. Her shoes clicked softly on the polished floor. People turned to watch her, puzzled by the older woman in the grey dress moving with such deliberate calm toward the front of the room. Maren reached Rowan's position near the AV control panel. She handed him the USB without breaking stride. He plugged it in. Sterling's pen touched the contract. The screens behind him flickered. The Halford Lumber logo disappeared. In its place, rows of financial documents filled both screens. Wire transfers, shell company registrations, authorization codes with Sterling's encrypted signature attached to each one. Dates, amounts, destinations, 6 years of theft displayed in clean, irrefutable columns. Sterling froze. The pen hovered above the paper. He turned slowly toward the screens. The ballroom fell silent. 300 people stared at the evidence scrolling behind the man who had just spoken about legacy and vision and the communities he served. Sterling's voice cracked across the room. "Turn those off. Someone shut those screens down." No one moved. The hotel staff looked at each other uncertainly. The screens continued scrolling. Sylvie's voice carried from the side of the room, clear and professional. "The evidence displayed has already been transmitted to federal authorities. Every transaction has been verified independently." Sterling turned toward the crowd. His eyes swept the room, searching for an ally, a sympathetic face, anything to hold on to. His gaze found Maren. She stood 10 feet from the stage. Her hands were at her sides. She did not look angry. She did not look triumphant. She looked like what she was, a 62-year-old retired school teacher who had been underestimated by everyone in the room and had chosen to show up anyway. Sterling's voice dropped to a hiss that only the nearest guest could hear. "You have no idea what you've done." Maren did not respond. She simply reached into her coat pocket and took out the folded dollar bill. She unfolded it slowly, one crease then the other, and placed it on the edge of the podium. The green paper looked impossibly small beneath the ballroom lights. $1. Lying on the polished wood surface beside a contract worth millions in front of a man who had once laughed when it was all she received. Maren's voice carried the quiet authority of a woman who had spent 35 years teaching children that every person in the room deserved to be heard. "Your grandfather left me this because he knew I would understand its value. Not the dollar, the trust behind it." She paused. The room held its breath. 3,000 people work for this company. He knew their names, everyone. A murmur passed through the crowd. Board members exchanged glances. Investors shifted in their chairs. And then Vivian Halford stood up. She had been sitting at a table near the front, silent throughout the evening, her silk scarf folded neatly beside her untouched champagne. She rose slowly, the way a person rises when they have been sitting with a decision for a long time and have finally accepted that the moment has come to stand behind it. She walked to the stage. The room watched her. Sterling watched her. His face changed not to anger but to something worse. Recognition. The recognition of a man who sees the last wall falling. Vivian's voice trembled, but she did not stop. "My father told me about Sterling's fraud before he died. He showed me the evidence. He asked me to act." She paused. Her eyes glistened. "I was too afraid. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility. I told myself someone else would handle it." She looked at Maren. "Maren did what I couldn't. She did what none of us were willing to do." The words settled over the ballroom like snow falling on still water. Sterling opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. The screens behind him continued their quiet testimony. Federal investigators entered through the main doors. Two men and a woman in dark suits moved through the crowd with the practiced calm of people who had done this many times before. One of them approached Sterling. The words were brief and professional. Sterling stared at the investigator's badge. Then he looked once more at the dollar bill lying on the podium. Small creased worth nothing and everything. And his face collapsed into something that was not rage and not grief, but the hollow bewilderment of a man discovering that the person he dismissed was the one person he should have feared. He was escorted from the ballroom without resistance. The room erupted into noise, questions, whispers, the staccato burst of camera flashes, but Maren did not hear any of it. She stood beside the podium and looked across the ballroom toward the back wall, where Genevieve stood alone, tears running freely down her face, one hand pressed against her mouth. Maren did not wave. She did not call out. She simply looked at her daughter across the distance of the crowded room and gave a single slow nod. The nod said everything that words could not. I see you. I know what it cost you. We are not broken. Genevieve nodded back, and for the first time in 14 months, the distance between them did not feel like a wound. It felt like a bridge. Spring came to the Finger Lakes the way it always did, not all at once, but in small accumulating gestures, a patch of green appearing through the last snow on a hillside, the sound of water moving beneath the ice on the creeks that fed into Seneca Lake. The first morning when the air carried something other than cold, something loamy and alive rising from the ground, like a long-held breath finally released. The farmstead on the southern shore had changed. The house stood straight now, its clapboard walls freshly painted white, the stone chimney cleaned and repointed. New windows caught the morning light. The barn had been repaired. New red paint over old boards, the doors rehung on proper hinges. Inside, the hatch to the bunker remained sealed beneath the floor. Its purpose fulfilled, its contents delivered to the hands that needed them. But the property had become something else entirely. A small sign stood at the entrance to the gravel road, hand-painted in careful letters, the Halford Calloway Learning Center. On a warm morning in late April, Maren stood on the wide front porch of the farmhouse, holding a mug of tea and watching 12 children file across the meadow toward the new classroom that had been built in the renovated barn. They carried backpacks and notebooks and the particular energy of young people who have not yet learned to be careful with their curiosity. The scholarship program had launched 3 weeks earlier. Funded by the trust, Wallace had hidden the same $50 million that had nearly been frozen, nearly been lost. It provided educational support for children in the rural communities surrounding Halcyon. Children whose parents worked at the mill, drove the lumber trucks, operated the machinery that kept Halford Lumber running. Children whose names Maren knew. Wallace would have written down if he had lived long enough to learn them. She watched them disappear into the barn, their voices rising and falling like birdsong. She could hear a teacher inside beginning the morning's lesson. The voice was young, patient, full of the particular energy that new teachers carry before the years teach them to pace themselves. Maren smiled. She recognized that energy. She had carried it herself once a long time ago in a classroom with tall windows that looked out over the lake. Footsteps on the porch. Genevieve sat down in the chair beside her. She held her own mug of coffee and wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. Her hair was pulled back loosely. She looked tired in the good way, the tiredness that comes from work that means something. Genevieve had left Halford Lumber the week after the gala. She had moved into the farmhouse in February. She had spent March painting walls, sanding floors, assembling bookshelves. She and Maren had worked side by side in the quiet, steady rhythm of two people rebuilding something larger than a house. They had not spoken about the phone call. They did not need to. Some things are understood between a mother and a daughter, without ever being named the way the lake understands the shore, through constant patient contact wearing away the sharp edges until what remains is smooth. Genevieve sipped her coffee and looked out at the meadow. The grass was green now, and wildflowers had begun to appear along the fence line, small blue and white blooms that Maren did not know the names of, and had decided not to look up because some things were better simply noticed. Genevieve's voice came quiet without urgency. The board confirmed the restructuring yesterday. The new management team starts Monday. Maren nodded. Halford Lumber had survived. Sterling faced federal charges that would take years to resolve. The company had been reorganized under transparent leadership. 3,000 workers still had their jobs. The mill still ran. The trucks still moved. The sound of saws and hydraulics still filled the valleys in the morning the way it had for 60 years. Maren had declined the chairman position the board offered her. She had never wanted to run a company. She had wanted to teach. And now, standing on the porch of a farmhouse that had been silent for years and was finally full of noise again, she was. A breeze moved across the meadow, carrying the scent of turned earth and new grass, and the faint mineral smell of the lake warming in the spring sun. Somewhere in the barn, a child laughed the sharp, unself-conscious laugh of someone who has just discovered something surprising and wonderful. Maren turned and walked inside the house. She stopped in the front room where the morning light fell in long rectangles across the wooden floor. On the windowsill, two objects sat side by side. The dollar bill framed in a simple wooden frame. George Washington's face calm and patient behind the glass. The paper still carried its original creases, two folds made by Maren's hands in a conference room, while people laughed preserved exactly as they were. And beside it, the lake stone, gray smooth warm where the sunlight touched it, placed there without ceremony on the day Maren moved in, as if it had always belonged on this particular windowsill in this particular light. She stood looking at them for a long moment. The dollar that was never about money, the stone that was never about stone. Two small objects holding the entire weight of a story that began with laughter and ended with something far quieter and far more lasting. She did not explain them to visitors. When the children from the scholarship program asked about the framed dollar, and they always ask because children notice the things adults have learned to walk past, she simply told them it was a gift from someone who believed she was worth more than anyone thought. The children accepted this without question. They were young enough to understand that value and price were not the same thing. Maren touched the edge of the frame lightly with her fingertips. Then she turned and walked back out onto the porch where Genevieve was watching the meadow and the lake beyond it, and the hills rising green and patient above the water, and the sky wide and pale, and filled with the kind of light that only comes in spring when everything that survived the winter is finally allowed to bloom. She sat down beside her daughter. Neither of them spoke. The tea grew cool. The children's voices drifted from the barn. The lake held its surface still and bright, hiding its best things at the bottom the way it always had. And that was enough. If you believe that the people who matter most are often the ones the world notices least, type the number 1 in the comments below. And if this story reminded you of someone in your own life, a teacher, a parent, a quiet person who never asked for recognition but deserved it, share their name. They might never see it, but you will have said it out loud. And sometimes that is all it takes. Subscribe if you'd like to stay for the next story. It's already waiting.